be defeated, who is to be invited at tables. What do we mean when we talk about spoilers? Because these things have not only strategic and operational implications for the robustness of peacekeeping, but also for whether or not, as you said, peacekeepers end up being just enforcers or also mediators, and whether or not basically peace is sustainable without the presence of boots on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, this is the first round of questions. I will ask Jean-Marie and Bill to answer.
I think I will answer your question and your question in a way together, because they from two different angles they come to the same point. You said I was talking about peace enforcement. Actually, I'm a person who the more troops I had under my responsibility, the more convinced I was that the civilians exaggerate what force can achieve. And that has to be a great deal of caution, and there's too much expectation, both I would say from the left, who think you fix Darfur by deploying a strong force in Darfur, or from the, let's say, the neocons in the US who think they can transform the Middle East by in Iraq or elsewhere. In both cases, excessive confidence in what force can achieve. I, for one, am convinced that force is not at all a negligible tool in helping a state stabilize, but it's a tool that has to be used with extreme care and with great awareness that a lot is in the execution, and the execution is extremely difficult. And so I wouldn't want the public here to think that I'm advocating a sort of loose use of force. I think in 90% of the cases, a peacekeeping operation should more, when I talked about the option, what is a stable state? A state that can crush its opponents, or a state that brings them under the tent? I think in 90% of the cases, the second option is the right option. And so that taking the military option, you have to do it only if you're absolutely sure that you have the capacity to win the game. I think otherwise you are engaging in a very dangerous path. But what does that mean? That means that you have to have a much broader sense of what the tent should be. And there was a little discussion on terrorism in the previous session. It's true that the world doesn't agree on the definition of terrorism. I think I'll take an example to be concrete, which is the example of Somalia. I think the conflict in Somalia, you can look at several circles, as in many conflicts. You have the Somali circle of the clans, the various groups in Somalia. I'm not an expert in Somalia, but certainly that's an important element of the conflict. You have the regional issue of the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, and that plays out in part in Somalia. And you have the so-called global war on terror. And that's pertinent because it raises the question, who are you prepared to deal with among the Shabab? Do you consider all Shabab as terrorists? Are you prepared to talk to some of them? This is a real question, because as people who have looked in the details of it, and the movement of like the Shabab, and I'm taking it as an example because it's a movement that indeed commits a lot of acts that would be considered acts of terrorism, that has some connections to Al Qaeda. Because of those connections, do you dismiss them completely, or do you engage in a political discussion with them? Today, to say that is totally, is not at all accepted. But I think in 2001, it was not at all accepted that one could discuss with the Taliban. And today, this is the fashion of the day. So I think perceptions evolve. I personally believe that for the United Nations, it's a very serious issue to be seen to be on one side of the war. And I think the United Nations, in my view, shouldn't be. The United Nations should be an organization that talks to everybody. I think that's the essence of the organization, but it's something that is very difficult to accept in liberal democracies. It's much better to be among people, like-minded people and countries, than to talk to people who are seen as the enemy. And for good reason. But the idea of the UN is that precisely it's a place where everybody can meet. And the added value of the UN is precisely that people you would not meet in another framework, you should be able to meet them in the UN. But that's my view. There is probably a minority view in the UN. I'm not in the UN.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jocelyn. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to comment. I'll cover. To comment on some of Jean-Marie's remarks in the context of the questions, and also then address specifically Neshla's question. First, on the issue of the Brahimi report and deterrence versus capabilities, absolutely agree. But that's also why we emphasize the need for capacity and capability within UN operations if deterrence was going to work. And also suggested that missions not be mounted if these kinds of capabilities could not be found, hence the two-stage mandate, which New Horizon has come back to advocating, but member states have yet to, I think, agree with, and it was rejected by the Council the first time around, but it was to avoid exactly that kind of dilemma. Secondly, on protection of civilians and force protection versus civilian protection. This is a question of risk and casualty shifting, right? Where are we going to take casualties? Do we leave it with the civilian population or take it in our own forces? And it is politically easier to a point to shift it to the local population, frankly. It's a fundamental problem. National soldiers are trained and prepared to give their lives for their own country. They're not trained and prepared so much to give their lives for somebody else's country, unless there's some big, large intellectual enterprise like the Cold War that binds them in an alliance together. So when the United States lost a couple dozen soldiers in Somalia, where U.S. interests had not been well defined, it was decided to withdraw within days. We lost thousands of troops in Iraq, but because the previous administration defined that as being within U.S. interests, it took several years for that to turn around, and only at the political and election level. And we actually reinforced after losing 3,000 people, rather than withdrew. And we're more or less repeating the same syndrome in Afghanistan, different reasons, but still because of the engagement, perceived engagement of national interests, as opposed to the greater good of mankind. And that is a reflection of how the international system is structured. Jean-Marie's remarks about robust peacekeeping being capable peacekeeping, and I think that's true. And the question of what is the goal of peacekeeping is a very fundamental one that the system fudges. The peace-building report from last summer cites all sorts of sort of tactical operational things that get done in the interest of peace building, but it doesn't really say why. Is it to build democracy? Is it really to protect human rights? There's something about, we should pay attention to the local parties protecting human rights, but it doesn't establish that as an international goal or obligation. And I think it very much is true. It's easier for the Security Council to spew tasks than it is to define a clear goal. And it may be the case, and Michael Lipson has got his finger on this issue, that there is irreducible ambiguity in what the Security Council does as a result, because to clear away the ambiguity is to expose the lack of consensus on goals. And finally, Neshla's question on robust peacekeeping, the impact of expanded mandates. there's a kind of natural, logical mission